Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich darf Sie herzlich willkommen heißen zu dem Abend hier heute, welcher stattfindet im Rahmenprogramm der Ausstellung Unter der Erde von Kafka bis Kippenberger, die Sie womöglich alle schon gesehen haben, hoffentlich. Und zwar haben wir eingeladen Thomas Demand und Brian Dillon. Die beiden werden sich gleich auf englischer Sprache unterhalten, etwa eine Dreiviertelstunde, sodass nachher noch auch für Sie eine Gelegenheit besteht, nochmal Fragen zu nennen und zu stellen. Ich würde Ihnen jetzt gerne die beiden kurz vorstellen. Und zwar einmal Thomas Demand. Er ist 1964 in München geboren, hat in das wollte ich noch sagen, ich wollte Ihnen verraten, dass er zwischen Los Angeles und Berlin pendelt tatsächlich. Er hat in München und Düsseldorf an den Kunstakademien studiert und am Goldsmiths College in London. Hier in Düsseldorf hat er bei Fritz Schwegler in der Bildhauerklasse studiert, leitet selber jetzt auch in der HFBK in Hamburg eine Bildhauereiklasse. Und seine Arbeiten, ich glaube, ich muss sie, also ich sage einfach nicht mehr viel dazu, sind überall ausgestellt und auch in den Sammlungen vertreten, so wie in unserer hier. Und jetzt tatsächlich kann ich nochmal die Gelegenheit nutzen, ihm öffentlich zu danken, dass er teilgenommen hat oder seine Zusage uns erteilt hat, an Unter der Erde teilzunehmen mit seiner Arbeit Grotte. Und vor allen Dingen aus unserer kuratorischen Perspektive ist das vor allen Dingen spannend, nicht, dass es 2 Jahre gekostet hat ihrer Zeit, sondern vielmehr auch der Rechercheprozess, der dem zugrunde gelegen hat. Also welche Grotten sind ihm auf dem Weg zu der perfekten Grotte begegnet. Und deswegen freuen wir uns sehr, dass Sie teilnehmen an der Ausstellung, dass Sie diese Recherche auch dokumentiert haben, also öffentlich gemacht haben, auch ausgestellt haben und dass Sie heute Abend hergekommen sind. Herzlichen Dank. Willkommen. Wie es zu dieser Konstellation gekommen ist, Thomas Demand und Brian Dillon hier gemeinsam in einem Gespräch. Wir haben wir haben Thomas Demand gefragt, wer denn sein Lieblingsgesprächspartner sei, und der hat uns Brian Dillon genannt und wir haben ihn eingeladen, er ist gekommen. Very welcome, Brian Dillon. Brian Dillon ist in Dublin geboren, 1969, lebt in Canterbury, Kent, also ein bisschen außerhalb von London, und ist britischer Herausgeber, eigentlich müsste es irischer Herausgeber der britischen Zeit oder des britischen Teils des Cabinet Magazine heißen. Er schreibt darin regelmäßig, beziehungsweise ist eben Herausgeber dieser. Er schreibt für Kunstmagazine und Zeitungen wie Artforum, Art Review, Guardian, Independent. 2005 hat er dann unter anderem über Thomas Demands Arbeit Poll geschrieben, die auch bei uns in der Sammlung ist. Und ihn allerdings jetzt nur als Kunstkritiker zu verstehen, wäre vollkommen falsch oder viel zu kurz gegriffen, denn er lehrt unter anderem am Royal College of Art in London Kunst- und Designkritik. Er ist Autor zahlreicher Bücher und Essays, Buchrezensionen, unter anderem schreibt er viel für das Times Literary Supplement und hat zweifach sich auch als Kurator betätigt. Jetzt kürzlich für die Tate und die Hayward Gallery, Tate Britain und Hayward Gallery, und hat über Ruinen zum Beispiel in der zeitgenössischen Kunst eine dieser Ausstellungen thematisch bearbeitet. Dazu ist auch ein Reader entstanden und unter anderem aber Themen waren auch die Geschichte der Hypochondrie, und zwar erzählt am Beispiel von Charles Darwin, Andy Warhol und Glenn Gould, und Verknüpfung autobiografischer Züge mit der Geschichte der Literatur, Philosophie und Kunst hat er zum Beispiel in The Dark Room in einem seiner Bücher 2005 getan. So thank you for coming, as well as for you. It might be that only English-speaking people are here, and use the chance to show you our newly published English edition book of the exhibition. So if you're interested, you can buy it downstairs. So I wish you a nice talk.
So, Thomas, thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. Shall I just begin? Yes. Why don't I begin? It's a great pleasure to be here. Thomas and I have just seen the exhibition for the first time, and I had simply seen the catalogue in the past few weeks, and the exhibition, I think, is everything that I hoped and suspected that it would be based on the catalogue. The theme of the underground, the theme of grottos, caves, tunnels, bunkers, submerged places, submerged passageways, whether real or imaginary, or projected into the future, or dredged up out of the past, make up an extraordinarily rich topic in terms of the history of art, in terms, in this exhibition, of contemporary work and recent work, but also in terms of the history of literature, and also many other art forms, including cinema, including architecture, and many other things that I hope we'll touch on in our conversation in a moment. One of the really rich and engaging things for me is the way that this exhibition marries art and literature in a way that never feels as if it's attaching one to the other. It never feels as if it's letting down one or the other. And I think the use of literature, especially in the audio guide and in the texts that kind of punctuate the show or the catalogue or the whole experience of events around this exhibition is really, really nicely done. And I think we're going to talk, some of the time we're going to talk about literary versions of this particular imaginary, this set of fantasies and realities that have to do with the underground. When we first discussed this conversation, Thomas said, let's not talk about my work. I'm going to ignore that. I think we're agreed that we're ignoring that. I think it might be a useful place to start by talking about Grotto, talking about the one work of yours that's in the show, how that work came about, the kinds of processes of research and looking and reading and thinking that are involved in that. Does that seem like a good place to start for you?
Absolutely. So I have to do my thanks as well. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very glad that you're all coming. I came to see this. If there is somebody who wants to, make us stop because it's going too fast, just raise your hand and we will, try to. I can translate as well parts. I don't want to translate the whole thing, but like if you don't enjoy yourself because we're speaking English too quickly, then just raise your hand and we try to accommodate you. What we see in the background is basically a collection of postcards which were my starting point to making Grotto. I later on made the entire process of making that Grotto into a show where I faked a museum installation, and I brought in different vitrines all the source material which I possibly could have used but I didn't use, but pretending that I was a scholar in grottos, which I'm not. In fact, until I started making the work, I never went to a grotto. And I kind of was quite surprised that everybody knows what a grotto is and many people haven't actually been. So the grotto as a topic seemed to be such a self-explanatory and totally simple proposition as a place of human culture in a sense, which is most predominantly transmitted, I think, by reproductions. The images you see behind, this is a little slideshow I put together of postcards from grottos, which Gerhard Stein collects, which is a collector of 50 or 60,000 grotto postcards. He's also, in his main profession, he's a TÜV-Prüfer, so he's gonna, in Mainz, and his hobby, and he has a lot of time at hand apparently, is to go to grottos, and he never goes into the grottos, he only goes to the postcard store and buys these postcards, and it's the biggest collection of postcards about grottos in the world as far as we know. And on these grottos, you see different topics of how people use grottos and what the projection space of grottos would be. And that's what I was after. I was never after the real grotto. In fact, only 3 weeks ago, in preparation for this talk, I went to the grotto I rebuilt in Mallorca. I didn't want to see it. And the main reason for not wanting to see it was because if you go and then it's a banal place, then you lost the work. And I always avoided to go to the places I'm working on because I thought, like, if you go there, then they might be actually really trite. They might be really trivial, and then it's gone. So in that sense, the grotto is a fantasy building. And some things I put in this show about the fake museology about grottos was, for instance, if you think of Kurt Schwitters, Der Märzbau, has an idea of a grotto, of an artificial grotto. Yeah, if you think of Hugh Hefner, in the Playboy guy has a grotto in his mansion for, you know, which is actually quite funny because it has rolls of tissue on every stalactite in case, you know, it's America. And so, and you have all these permutations. Of course, literature, you have them in cinema, like, you know, grottos you have them in opera. You know, of course, Tannhäuser, the opening comes and, you know, starts in a grotto. So then we will talk about other permutations of, or like expressions or renderings of grottos. And for me, that topic of the grotto was so amazingly beautiful as a projection space that I thought I would like to try to build the perfect grotto. And then I looked at 1,000 photographs, and of course the first ideas they were influenced by Novalis and Goethe going to the grotto in the Harz. And, you know, the idea of the romantic grotto and then I saw the photographs, they will be up here as well. And I saw the postcards and I thought, like, they all too dreamery. They're becoming too much of a Märchenwelt, Märchenspielplatz, you know, like the fairy tale. And that is because we have seen so many of them in films, like Harry Potter. I'm sure there's a grotto in that one. And there's, like, you know, like you have seen them, how they would be like a cliche. And I just wanted to make a grotto which actually makes you, you know, surprises you in its complexity, but doesn't become the cliche of a grotto, even if you know exactly what it is, because even if you haven't been in a grotto before in your life. So I needed to kind of find this fine tune where it's still amazing, but it's not digested yet as a romantic place or whatever. And the trouble with the romantic postcards of the grottos, you know, is that you read figures in there, which is also a very interesting aspect in grottos. See, that's the Gerhard Stein in Mainz, if you ever need a grotto postcard. And so the images of grottos, as we would kind of immediately jump to, or I would kind of immediately associate with, they have this iconic quality of the stalactite, the stalagmite. They might resemble something. You read into these things, and the how do you call it? The anthropomorphism we apply on those. You know, like, oh, this looks like the king, this looks like the queen, this looks like an old castle, this looks like a ruin of a church or something like that, is another amazing thing about grottos, that we just, you know, we go below the ground and we just kind of see the negative version of our world from upstairs in the grotto. And so all these things, of course, if you make a picture, they're so rich in connotations that I thought I'm drilling in a big, you know, tank of references when I'm starting working on the grotto.
So one of the starting points is that the grotto is essentially artificial, right? I mean, whether its material or its form is actually absolutely artificial, or whether it's based on, whether it emerges out of an already existing geological formation, for example. So, I mean, you talk about what you think about, or what one might think about immediately when you talk about grottos. If you say grotto to somebody like me, brought up as an Irish Catholic, then it's a thing that you pray in front of. And it's an artificial space, but it's precisely a space of apparition. It's a space in which you might have a statue or a number of statues, an arrangement of figures, but there's always the possibility within that something will happen. And historically, at least in my childhood, the thing that might happen is the statues might start moving. There's always that kind of possibility of some kind of apparition. In other words, it's a space that's always readable, or always has certain kinds of expectations. So in making the work, in kind of pulling away from what you describe in another context as a kind of iconic, touristic kind of iconicity, is sheer physical complexity. I mean, the work that's in the show is, as you say, extraordinarily complex. The image and the space depicted is extraordinarily complex. Is that sheer level of intricacy the kind of the process by which you get away from that and turn it into something else, go somewhere else?
Well, how do you start this? Because, you know, part and part, yes and no. I mean, anything I say here is like, in German you say, hinterher wird immer ein Schuh daraus. So afterwards, it's always becoming a shoe. But before that, you have all these parts and you think like, maybe, you know, one of them was, I'm not a big fan of papier-mâché, so making a stalactite out of like, you know, the pulp was like thoroughly unattractive to me, like sitting around with like gloves and then, you know, like it would become theater somehow. I needed to apply a process. And then one of the main ingredients of grottos is the time. The time being written in. It's the time frame of what you look at is so, for a human being, so unrational in a sense, because, you know, it's half a centimeter if you get 100 years old. So you constantly compare yourself, your own existence with, you know, the display, and you think like, I'm actually nothing. And that's one of the most moral and ethical impacts a visit of the grotto can have to you. And so you have these, you know, the time, and somehow I needed to I thought I need in the process of making that thing, it has to have a certain relation to time. So when you stand there and you realize how it's made, that it's not like a snapshot. It becomes the end of a long journey to get what it is. And then I thought about then architecture, like, you know, it's the earliest kind of idea of architecture, of a home or something, you know, like of a retreat. And that's where we all have all the paintings from grottos, is like people probably living there or probably trying to get shelter there. So in architecture, very simply, you just make these landscape models and you make them with layers. You know the classic kind of rendering of a slope, and the white villa stands on the slope, is like making layers of the landscaping. And so I thought, if I invert that, and it's basically the negative, a grotto is the negative mountain, it's like inside the mountain, I could probably take this technique to kind of make it, which meant that it will be very complex, because you have to design the whole grotto somewhere else, not on the sculpture. You have to design it in your head and in a computer. And so, you know, that complexity came together, but it was many things, and I'm never expecting that many people kind of get all the ingredients of how this is made. Another thing is the shadow, the light. You know, we look at grottos, every photograph here is actually, the first step of making a grotto an artificial place is bringing light inside. You know, and you have to imagine when Goethe lets himself down on a rope in Harz, in the classic, when he writes about this, he has one fackel, he has one, you know, light, fire, and it's moving. So the light is moving, he's on a rope, and he goes down and he sees more shadows than actually things. So he sees all these shadows moving behind the stalactites and stalagmites, and it must have been mind-blowing. And that's the first experience of going to grottos and then tell the people on the top of the world what is the underworld. Must have been, you know, absolutely beyond imagination for anyone. And so how do you bring the light in there, in that structure, without making it a kitsch, which you could do with lots of colors, without making it, you know, showing that there is a light bulb, which would be, you know, counterproductive in the end, because that's not what it's about, but kind of illuminating the grotto in a sense that you still see the sculpture, and you just, you know, it's not overly dramatic. You have a sense of space, the foreground and the background. But of course, that's the most artificial part in any rendering of the grotto we see, is like bringing down the light.
One of the recurrent kind of motifs in writing about caves and the underground in literature, and especially in the classic 19th century texts on the underground, and Jules Verne is the obvious example, is that actually the space itself glitters. It has its own light. So if you read the initial descent of the travelers, of the explorers in Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, there's a moment of going into what appears to be dark, but actually very quickly it's illuminated. And there's an extraordinary passage in which Verne tells us, you know, it's as if the kind of gods of the underworld are welcoming the visitors by hanging out these lights. There's a sense that every surface scintillates or sparks. Everything every detail in the space gives off its own light. And actually, in a way, that's not antithetical to what you're describing with Goethe going down with the single light, because what that does is to cast the one light on every surface. Does that make sense? That somehow the grotto or the cave or the space is a place that can be illumined by the kind of act, the moment of discovery, but at the same time, it is itself radiant. It's been immured in this kind of darkness, and then there is this moment of discovery when literally it's almost as if in Verne, every atom of the interior of the hollow earth is gleaming at one moment. And it's a kind of thread that runs through an awful lot of the representation of these spaces. I wonder if we might talk about some of those references, because partly the grotto, your grotto, has an origin, it has a kind of lineage in the history of...
Sorry. That should never anybody happen to you.
There's also a long history in thinking about caves and grottos of messages, of sound coming from elsewhere, of being connected in one space to many other spaces at the same time, but we'll come back to that. So I wonder if, or to what extent, those kinds of reference points, the literary ones, like Verne, for example, are present in your mind in making a work like that?
Well, as I said, it was, like you just read Novalis in school. So basically you have this kind of idea. You then, Homer, the Cyclope, the cave of the Cyclope, you have it there. You have it, there's 1,000 of, so the play, it's more like the backstage for Wagner opera, as I said. Like you have the backstage of the place, but you haven't been. So it's an amazing space for imagination of King Ludwig. I'm coming from Bavaria, and of course, the cave of King Ludwig, which we just learned, by the way, he was the first one to use electric light bulbs. So, it was a hyper-modern place at the same time, as it was like this kind of overly timeless entertainment place. But like as an artist, I have to say, it's only leading you that far, because you don't want to, as you say, what's really beautiful about the show downstairs is the connection to literature is never explaining anything. It's more like an association. But like as an artist, you can read this and know this, but it doesn't give you much to work with, because it will be too literal in the very literal sense of the word. It will be too much of a, it's more like the flagpoles, what you don't want to do. You don't want to make a thing about a piece of writing. And I'm actually not a big fan of making art about art anyway. So it's just, it's a very, like this postcard. This is the Hermannshöhle in Rübeland. This is, for instance, one in the Harz, which was there you see one is called the King, and one is called the Gnome, and one is called Alberich. So, that's a classic picture of, and I have a couple of those. So, and if you get too close to that preformed idea of the way how literature writes about this, it doesn't fly for me. I'm trying to stay away from that, but I'm totally aware. And the idea of the show, I did a show in Venice once where I showed the actual model, which I never did before and I never did afterwards either, together with the photograph which you see downstairs and that fake museology. And so basically, I called the show Processo Grotesco, but I wanted to kind of get the photograph away from the model, because, of course, you don't need both, you need either or. And so I needed to kind of disconnect the chronology of the thing. So you came in, you see the photograph first, and then you see the museology to it, and then you see the grotto as a real thing, just because I could. And so in that room, we had all these paraphernalia, and it's quite, but it is not really what I needed for doing that. What I needed for doing that is an imagination, and then I needed a couple of great people to help me, because you can't do that thing alone. And you need to kind of, what I needed was patience and an idea of the light. That's the main thing for me.
You mentioned Ludwig. There's a kind of extent to which the grotto, or the cave in general, sort of functions as a place in which those sorts of associative relationships that you're describing, rather than having a literal relationship with the literature, the cave is a place in which that kind of association is possible. There's an extraordinary short story from 1916, which some people may know, by Apollinaire, called The Moon King, which is, as you'd expect, partly about Ludwig. And its narrator descends into a cave he's become, I think, lost in a storm, and he finds refuge in a cave, and as he descends, he sees a figure. The cave is illuminated, like many of these caves are in these stories, and seated at a large organ, musical organ, or so it seems, is the figure of Ludwig. And he's playing a keyboard, but the keyboard doesn't play musical notes. It plays the sounds of far-flung places elsewhere in the world. So when he presses one key, he can hear somebody in a field in Japan or China. When he presses another key, he can hear a street in New York. And there's a long tradition in which the cave or the grotto functions not as a place that's, you mentioned the idea of the cave or the underground as a kind of home, and that's, I think, that's a really interesting strand in the show, the idea that there's a kind of domestic space. But it's also at a much expanded and completely different scale. The cave somehow connects to other places. It's somehow endless, and potentially it has sonic connections or connections through light refracted or reflected, to a kind of infinity of other places. And it's one of the things that really struck me about your work here, is that space is potentially limitless. Isn't that kind of one of there's a sort of paradox in that the underground functions at one and the same time as a place of retreat, of enclosure, of hiding away from the world, of locking your doors, of pulling over the grass or the turf as the creature in Kafka's story, the burrow, in English, burrow, does. But it's also, and again, actually in Kafka's story, it's a place where you can hear things, unexpected things, where you can hear things at a distance. And I wonder whether there is also in your work, maybe more generally, not just in this work specifically, a kind of sense that those enclosed spaces, domestic or industrial or architectural, are always somehow opening onto the world as well. The way that you describe light seems to kind of suggest that.
Partly it's like, I did a lot of interior spaces. And so if you think about the genesis of the idea of the interior space, where is the earliest interior space? That would be obviously one of them. It would be just, a rock formation which gives you shelter. So that wasn't really very far-fetched for me. But what you said about the Ludwig thing is quite interesting, because it shows you also that the imagination, what that place could be in literature, is a very different one from a visual one. Because it's the center of the world where all the voices go together, and of course it's a dream. It's a dream scenario, but it also shows you that Apollinaire thinks of the grotto as a place where meaning is generated, and I wouldn't think of that. I would not kind of go that far and say, look, this is where the underworld is coming from or something. So for me, it's a backdrop for your imagination, but it's not explaining you what it would be. And literature very often has to explain it because it only has words, and the whole thing has to have a narrative from the beginning to somewhere. So for me, to show the place in all its connotations, for me also would be very important to just kind of focus on the render of the representations of that space rather than the real place. It would be totally uninteresting for me to, actually, even this is a sense of a grotto, by the way, but it would be even uninteresting for me to go to the real place. It would be, that's not what it is about. It's about the idea of that and the proposition of seeing things and faces in it. Which you do, because and if you look at the Max Ernst, which I'm very happy to be next to, because what he takes from that and the intricate detail he has on these small paintings is really quite a beautiful and light and unexplanatory reference to the work for me, And so if you go through the rest of the show, I think it's also, it seems to be quite also like a breeding. Breeding with the Unheimliche, with the uncanny somehow. It just like, most of things which come from the underworld seem to be male, like it's one woman in the show. It seemed to be uncanny. It seemed to be not very comfortable. I mean, even the children's room is not exactly comfortable in a sense, and so. And not easy to understand. If you look at the Jeff Wall photographs, it's like it's the dark, it's the hole, it's just or Matt Mullican's drawings. It's like it's hell or something like that. And I worked once, which is related but a little bit parallel universe. I worked once on a series about something which I had to do for another series of Max Beckmann about the apocalypse, and I was wondering. He did this in 1943 or something in the Netherlands, and it was a commission which basically paid for his rent. He was like really broke and desperate and depressed and everything. So somebody wanted to give him the consignment to kind of make a series of lithographs about the apocalypse. And he wasn't a Catholic or anything, so he wasn't really very well relating to the story. But I was wondering at the time, what is the space of imagination for somebody like Beckmann? And in comparison of the apocalypse, in comparison to us. And for us, it's a film. It's Apocalypse Now. It's Batman, where the Batman has all his kind of super tools. It's it's so fully filled up with like exploitations and like commercializations of that uncanny of the underground, which is, Beckmann, I doubt that he ever saw a photographic image of something which would be rendering the hell for him. Or something, because they're even like Caligula no, not Caligula. All the horror films of the 20s and 30s wouldn't have very explicit photographs or like film stills or settings of what we think is a horror, the underworld, the horror of the underworld. So for us, it's kind of this. I'm sure there are video games with grottos, and I know that there are many animated films about grottos and stuff, but I think the idea, the imagination of the underworld for a generation 60 years ago is very, very different from ours, for instance.
The cinematic kind of lineage of imagining apocalypse and imagining its subterranean aftermath, which is kind of one of the motifs, the idea of retreat, and actually that idea of the retreat of humanity, or the retreat and then reappearance of an entire race, of an entire civilization, goes back through, it's a long-running theme in the 19th century novels, for example, on that theme. But in cinema, it largely, and especially in the kind of Hollywood version, repeats all of the cliches of that fiction. So a kind of dialectic between, on the one hand, the underground as a domestic, a kind of cozy space. Those moments in movies when descending into the bunker, you discover that actually civilization has for decades been planning a very cozy bourgeois existence several hundred or thousand feet inside the earth. And it very often just repeats an idea of whatever the domestic interior of the recent past. I saw an old 1980s BBC drama called Edge of Darkness recently. It was repeated, and it's from the kind of, the height of the recurrence of Cold War anxiety in the 1980s. And it features a scene in which the characters descend into a series of caves where supposedly nuclear waste has been stored, and there's potential for a kind of catastrophe. And right at the center of it is this perfectly preserved 1950s domestic space in which there's a gramophone to play your opera records on, and there are cans of 1950s food. And that vision of domesticity is completely retained in this tiny, tiny contained little space. But it's a total cliche. But it's itself a cliche of the form. It's a cliche of TV, and it's a cliche of cinema. It seems to me that if in the mid-20th century in film, but also actually in photography, because in this case they're the same thing, the work that would escape that would be La Jetée, would be Chris Marker's film, 1962, where the post-apocalyptic underground is just sketched really briefly. It's a series of, at most, a dozen images of tunnels. The tunnels happen to be beneath the Palais de Chaillot. In other words, they're beneath the Cinémathèque Française. In 1962. So there is this, what that sort of suggests is that the fully imagined the absolutely fantastically imagined underground lapses in those instances into cliche. The fantastic is actually something that you can sketch. The really affecting in a work like Markers is something that you can sketch really quickly. And I wonder if that is true also of the art in this show, that in some cases the most affecting works are the ones that actually have absolutely retreated from that idea of a labyrinthine, absolutely detailed, scintillating, complex structure, and merely kind of sketched it, merely invoked something that actually is a kind of, is itself a sort of icon. I'm thinking of some of the works on paper, some of the drawings, for example.
But I don't think we're here to, because the show is over more or less.
We're not here to judge the show.
No, but like what's very poignant on the show is like it's very physical. There's hardly works on the wall, which you would imagine would be dominant in a show like that, because you can't bring a grotto, so you bring renderings of the grotto, or like the underworld, but it's a very physical show, so there's big things in there, and you have to walk through a tunnel, and you have to, it's actually not a tame endeavor in a sense. But you just touched on something else, which is, of course, it is picking on the point I just made with Beckmann and his imagination of the apocalypse. Beckmann isn't important in that. It's just like the idea of you just mentioned the other kind of the how do you say, the way how we connotate the grotto after the Second World War completely changed as well, in literature as well. For instance, Pynchon, when he writes V about the Germany after the Second World War, he writes about this travel to this huge artificial cave where they make the V like the Wunderwaffe, and if you go to Nordhausen, you have like this that is a whole concentration camp to kind of produce that thing underneath the earth, because they were thinking that the British bombers would never find it or something. And then you have all the stories about like the gold being stored somewhere in a cave. You have suddenly, so you use the underworld as the invisible, and you just add to the idea of the hell, the really old conventional idea that hell is downstairs, or the ghosts, or like all the bad, like the how do you say, the Geister, not the ghosts. It's a really crude word for that, but like, the spirits, no, but also like, the gods and nymphias, and like the fabula is like down there. Suddenly it becomes this kind of cave of horror as well, end of crime. It suddenly becomes a crime place as well. So you have all the paintings being stored somewhere, like the paint to kind of keep them away from the enemy or something. So when La Jetée comes out, of course, that is already the backdrop. It's not the backdrop anymore of the 1910s, where Jules Verne kind of writes about the underworld with Ludwig playing an opera, Apollinaire playing the organ or something. So the cave in the 20th century also has this kind of, or the underworld, or the entrance to the bunker. Like Thomas Schütte's piece down there is like very clear. It's very beautifully showing that you don't even need to see what's, it's clearly like on a piece of wood, and the bunker is more like a proposition. The bunker is the idea of hiding away, which of course brings you to Switzerland, where they want to hide their bunkers, because, that is not, in Heideland, you don't want to have, you don't want to have the entrances to be discovered or like too prominent in the landscape. So I don't know whether that adds, but like the idea of the grotto, I think, is also, it's what I said in the beginning, somehow the negative of our world. Whatever we have left over as a projection, we kind of project onto the space below.
I mean, if you put it like that, then it goes back to the comment that you made right at the beginning about time. And it seems like there are actually a number of time scales at work in a space like the one represented in your work, or any of these underground spaces that are partly material, or partly real, and are partly imaginary. And one of those time scales is to do with preservation. So as you say, storing paintings, the National Gallery in Britain stored its paintings in a slate mine in Wales during the Second World War. So there is an idea of freezing a moment, as it were, in that case merely for a few years. But actually, there's now a vast industry in underground storage. And in fact, I've been to one of these places run by a company called Deep Store in England. There's a salt mine in Cheshire in which the archives of the National Archive, Britain's kind of national archive, are stored, hospital archives, police archives. But alongside all of this, because it's been going on for decades, is a whole lot of technology, including cars and trucks that were used originally to bring material into these spaces. And those have been sitting there for maybe 30, 40 years, perfectly preserved, absolutely pristine. And if you're taken on a tour of this, the people who work for this company, Deep Store, are very proud at the moment where they tell you, you know, if we took these objects, these cars, trucks, machinery, etc., up to the surface of the earth, it would disintegrate within weeks. It would rust away immediately. So there's this fantasy, whether that's true or not, there's still a kind of element of fantasy in it, which is the idea that they're absolutely preserving all of this against catastrophe. But there are other timescales involved, aren't there? And one of them is actually not to do with the preservation of the past or the present. It's to do with a kind of projection into the future. Caves and grottos are spaces of projection. You know, Robert Smithson in 66, 67 makes this fantastic drawing for a projected underground cinema, and it's partly a pun because he's punning on the idea of an underground cinema. But actually, there are many underground cinemas around the world now. But there's also this kind of sense in which the underground projects into a possible future. And some of that is catastrophic. There's the Cold War history. There's also the kind of satire of the Cold War. In the early 60s, there's a book, satirical text, report from Iron Mountain, published in the States, supposedly written by a secret cabal within the American military, arguing against the idea of peace, arguing for nuclear catastrophe as a way of remaking the world. And it's purely fictional, it's purely satire, but there are to this day certain right-wing groups in the United States who believe that it's real, that text was real. So there's this strange confusion, and those are exactly the kinds of right-wing, pseudo-military, quasi-military groups who are preparing for that future now. So all of those timescales get confused, and they get projected into this idea that there's a kind of secret, there's an underground, in the metaphorical sense, becomes bound up in the period you're describing after the Second World War with an idea of conspiracy, essentially.
There is another aspect to what you just said, and I know that there's a misunderstanding, but it would be quite interesting and probably a different talk to kind of try to find out what the political implication of the underworld is, because you say right-wing. So I just immediately try to imagine a left-wing movement who wants to be in a grotto, and it doesn't really work, because of course the right-wing thinks like there is conservative or whatever. I don't know, that's his projections, but I don't have an answer to that. But it's so weird that you would not be able, the future as a happy place cannot be executed in the subterranean for some reason. Or so, like the utopian, like the better society of tomorrow will be, or whatever, or the freedom is not exactly like the underground is more about like keeping things as they are, and like kind of taking time, the impact of time out of things, rather than going to, of course there's a completely misunderstanding of right-wing ideology, but like it doesn't really fly with utopian living in a sense. Like if you go to Montreal, for instance, then like half of the city is because it's so freaking cold there, like the half of the city is below the earth level, and it's just actually not utopian. It's just, it never was becoming like the future or something. It's certainly a practical thing. But I think we nearly 9 o'clock, and the one thing you said which would close the circle nicely is also in America there's this one of the biggest in Virginia, I think it's the biggest photographic archives is in a mountain too. So they keep, because they know that they deteriorate, and they do that lesser though.
Is this the Corbis archive?
Exactly,
the
Corbis archive. Yeah. And it's a massive thing, and all the Ansel Adams and all the Haltendeutsch and all the all the classic photography we know, which deteriorates, and to kind of keep it around, they brought it into a cave. And one day my picture will be in that cave too, hopefully. And so here we are, a cave in a cave in a cave.
That sounds like a perfect point at which to retreat. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Brian. So, if there is we answer any question as long as it's kind of topologically to that show related.
Yes, in your discussions here, I think you have mentioned now dozens of symbols, what grottos or caves can be. But what I was a bit surprised that the one that seemed to me much one of the most important one is that caves is where art started. Caves is where art started, as far as we know. At least for what we have left are those caves in Spain and in southern France, where really the first time really art made its presence felt. And I was wondering, when you think about caves and what you did with it, whether you also consider that as part of inspiration, or whether that was just out of your thought.
To be honest, afterwards it's easy to say that it was all in the play, but there's one film which I recommend if you want to see one 3D film in your life, then you should see The Cave of the Forgotten Dreams by Werner Herzog, because it's a 3D film, and you just realize he goes into that cave and you cannot see the drawings as a reproduction. You have to see them in 3D, like how they undulated on the three-dimensional surface, because they kind of took that in not in command. You took that in consideration, how the topography of the cave is like working with the animals running through from left to right, and at the same time you see still the charcoal on the ground as the guy who drew it just left. It's unbelievable. It's really the most wonderful grotto rendering I know, and it's paired with like Herzog's, whether you never know whether he has humor or he's so dry, his humor is so dry that you just project it onto him. But this is, of course, but the thing is, like, as an artist, even if it sounds pompous, but like, I wouldn't like to work on another artist's work, really, because I'm, on one hand, they're so fantastically great that I don't have to add anything to that. And on the other hand, imagine there would be drawings on my grotto there. I think it would be redundant. It would be the whole idea of that, to put another layer on top of that there are also drawings and there have been people in the grotto, then it suddenly becomes a place. And I wanted to actually make it an idea rather than a place. But your point is totally true. Of course, and talking about preservation, like, many of the grottos are closed now because humans with their breath and everything. That's actually me. It's a very good thing in a grotto in Rübeland, which I visited afterwards just to kind of prove that I have been in one.
Of course, your question and your point is completely right. But I suppose one of the interesting things to think about the history of the representation of the underground is that it takes place without that knowledge, without the knowledge of the earliest artworks on cave walls, without Lascaux, etc. And now, of course, as Thomas says, many of those places are, for very good scientific reasons, closed, but they've also been reproduced. So that when you visit these caves, you visit the reproduction.
It's very funny. I did a talk, so everything becomes like connected. I did a talk about Matisse, which the other thing you should really see is the Matisse show in the Tate, by the way. And the only thing I could get a hold of was, like, there was this person who worked with Matisse in the late years, and she glued all the paper cuts on paper for him. And then later, the next thing she did, she gave asylum to a guy from Algeria and got into prison for that. And the next thing after that, that's biography of a person called Gloria, which was a very flamboyant person. And then the next one she did was she helped remaking Lascaux, you know, the grotto, because that was like an artistic project. When they made it, they just wanted to save the grotto, but they said, we cannot have this kind of done by, you know, academics. We need to have it done by artists. So the replica of Lascaux you can visit today is a very artistic project, in fact. So, any other? Like, you can also pose the question in German and I translate it, if you...
Maybe I want to add that I'm very happy that you mentioned the Beckmann Apocalypse exhibition with your work Klause, because it's seeing in the part of uncanny topic downstairs, because we tried first when we thought of doing the exhibition Beneath the Earth, we said, oh no, we are not allowed to show anything that is upstairs. So, but then we said, okay, no, this is ridiculous to do so. So we have the Schutzräume, for example, which are not subterranean, but with the children's room of Schneider and the Christoph Büchel narrative of his work, which was not realized here, where he wanted to do a Natascha Kampusch part of Into a Big Tunnel piece, is that your Klause piece is so wonderfully uncanny that, for me it's I can tell another story. Not like Beneath the Ground, it would be another exhibition, but I could further tell something. So thank you for that, because this.
You know, that is because you say that with Kampusch, I looked at these photographs as well, and of course everybody remembers that story. But in a sense, I made a step away from that because I thought there's nothing I can add as an artist, other than just probably show how miserable it was down there. And I think it needs to have another level of reason to it. There has to be something else. Otherwise, you just kind of it's a very fine line, of course, and everything can be like, you know, he should do it or whatever. But like, I think you might just jump on a bus which has on the front sensation by really sad cases or something, you know, as a destination. And I don't, you know, I think you need to find a way how to maybe play it. And the Klause, for instance, it turned out never anything happened there, you know, and it turned out that the whole idea of the Klause, what was so horrible, was actually a construction by the media and our imagination of like the case, and the case didn't happen. It was a complete fabrication from the beginning to the end, and the case has to be disclosed without a solution. The boy is still missing, but it definitely is clear that it wasn't happening in that place. So in a sense, it's about the phantom of a case, but it's not about the real case. If the boy would have been really raped or whatever in that place, I would have never wanted to be part of that. I just thought, you know, like, you just, as an artist, you have to, I think, at least for my understanding, you have to have another level of creating a meaning to the thing than just, oh, look how horrible it is. Because then it's kind of a too short. For me, it would be too short as an operation. It wouldn't be. And what can I say? I mean, the Kampusch case is like the imagination of, or like, what's the other guy? The guy who had a whole family in Austria. You know, you just think like, wow, this is so unbelievable. As an artist, why would I think that art has anything to do with this? You know, or why do I think that the story is in its own is so overwhelming that you just, I would find it very hard. And in fact, if you look at painting, the history of painting, for instance, but please correct me if I'm wrong, there are not that many paintings which, you know, important paintings which would kind of actually paint stories of horror like that as a realistic case. You know, there might be the Manet with the shooting of King Maximilian in Mexico, but it's not that many, you know, battle paintings, but like the history of painting battle paintings are important, but the history of painting has been written through painting, not through the battle. So, you know, I might say something else tomorrow, but like at the moment, I think like, you know, like it reminds me an old kind of thought I had, like sitting around about the campus thing. It needs to have an artistic concern, otherwise it's just sensationalism, I think. What do you think?
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right. I think that there's an interesting moment right now, in fact, this week, regarding tunnels, and specifically regarding the tunnels in Gaza. And I don't know, some people might have seen the text by Amir Nizar Zouabi, the screenwriter and theatre director, published in Haaretz yesterday, in which there's the kind of projected into the future, an imagined future in which the population of Gaza has retreated underground and re-emerges at some unspecified moment in the future to find that the present has eradicated itself, has destroyed itself. It's an astonishing text. It's just about 2,000 words, absolutely, you know, extraordinarily compressed and suggestive and productive at the same time. And that it seems to me that one can think of many other examples. This just happens to be the one that is historically pressing now, in which the concrete, specific, practical use of the underground, deployment of the underground in a military or geopolitical or commercial way has a real kind of impinges on the present, impinges on our historical present, and sort of demands some response. And I'm quite sure personally that your response to those particular stories, which is to say, if you're going to respond as an artist, it must be obliquely. I suspect that that's the right one, but a sort of projection, as kind of sci-fi seems one, you know, in this particular example, a kind of sci-fi seems like one response to that.
Yeah, it's about translation in a sense, of course. But do we have anybody with another question? Because otherwise we wrap up. And thank you very much for your attention and attendance. Was a pleasure, I hope. It was a bit free floating, but you know, nevertheless, not everybody left, so it must have been okay.
We were warned that everybody might leave, partly because I can only speak English.
Thank you very much, and have a very nice evening.
Thank you very much indeed.